On January 7th, 2025, Donald Trump refused to rule out using military force to seize Greenland. Not might use, not considering. Refused to rule out. 3 days later, Denmark announced emergency defense spending increases of $47 billion, specifically for the Arctic. Not infrastructure, not social programs. Defense, Arctic defense. Within 72 hours, Russia deployed its largest Arctic naval task force since the Cold War. 43 warships, nuclear submarines, strategic bombers conducting live-fire exercises. And here's what nobody's telling you. This isn't a diplomatic spat. This isn't Trump being Trump. This isn't even about Greenland. This is the exact moment when NATO's 75-year security architecture began its terminal collapse. And Putin knew it was coming. He's been positioning for this exact scenario since 2007, 18 years of systematic preparation for this precise opportunity. The Arctic contains 13% of the world's undiscovered oil, 30% of undiscovered natural gas, $4 trillion in rare earth minerals, the specific elements that make semiconductors, electric vehicles, and advanced weapon systems possible. Neodymium, dysprosium, terbium. China currently controls 90% of global rare earth processing. The Arctic deposits could break that monopoly, and the Northwest Passage, which will reduce shipping times between Asia and Europe by 40% within the next decade. Not by 10%, 40%. A container ship from Shanghai to Rotterdam currently takes 34 days through the Suez Canal. Through the Arctic, it takes 20 days. That's a 14-day advantage on routes that carry $18 trillion in annual trade. Whoever controls the Arctic doesn't just access resources, they control the logistics infrastructure of the 21st century global economy. And right now, at this exact moment, we're watching the United States voluntarily detonate the alliance that was specifically designed to prevent exactly this outcome. This isn't speculation. This is pattern recognition. And the pattern is absolute. Let me prove it to you. Empires don't destroy themselves through military defeat. They don't collapse because they run out of money. They fragment because they prioritize short-term domestic politics over long-term strategic commitments. And it happens in 4 stages, every single time. No exceptions across 2,500 years of documented history. Stage 1, alliance formation driven by existential threat. A dominant power creates a security coalition because the alternative is destruction. The threat is real. The commitment is total. The junior partners surrender sovereignty in exchange for protection. This stage can last decades, even centuries. But it requires one non-negotiable element. The dominant power must demonstrate absolute reliability, unconditional, predictable, beyond question. The moment that reliability becomes questionable, the moment allies start calculating alternatives, stage 2 begins. Stage 2, overextension and mixed signals. The dominant power starts pursuing national interests that contradict alliance commitments, not openly, not officially, through policy inconsistency, through diplomatic freelancing, through public questioning of alliance value. The dominant power doesn't announce they're abandoning commitments. They just start behaving in ways that make those commitments look conditional. And junior partners, who have entire government ministries dedicated to analyzing exactly these signals, they notice immediately. They don't leave the alliance. Not yet. They start parallel conversations. They explore alternatives. They delay commitments. They recalculate costs. This stage accelerates rapidly because trust, once questioned, cannot be restored through words alone, only through actions. Consistent, repeated, costly actions that demonstrate commitment beyond doubt. And if those actions don't come, if instead the mixed signals continue or intensify, stage 3 arrives faster than anyone expects. Stage 3, strategic decoupling under pressure. An external adversary applies pressure to the alliance's weakest point, not to destroy the alliance directly, that's too expensive, too risky, too likely to trigger unified response. Instead, they force the dominant power into a choice. Alliance commitment or domestic political survival. And the dominant power chooses domestic politics. Every time. Not because leaders are weak, not because they don't understand strategy, because empires don't collapse from external conquest. They collapse from internal rot, the loss of elite consensus, domestic political fragmentation, economic pressures that make foreign commitments look like luxuries rather than necessities. The junior partners see this choice happen in real time. They watch the dominant power choose its own political survival over their security, and they make their own calculations accordingly. Stage 4, the inevitable outcome, the alliance becomes a paper institution. It exists in name only. Meetings still happen. Statements still get issued. The headquarters building doesn't close, but the strategic function dies. The mutual defense commitments become optional. The coordination mechanisms atrophy. And the adversary moves into the vacuum. Not through invasion, not through conquest. Through systematic exploitation of the power void. They establish facts on the ground in disputed territories. They build economic partnerships that lock in long-term advantages. They create new security architectures that exclude the former dominant power. and that former dominant power, now focused on internal concerns, cannot respond effectively. Because the alliance that would have enabled a coordinated response no longer functions. The pattern is simple. The pattern is observable. The pattern is absolute. Now let me prove this to you with 3 historical examples. Same pattern, same stages, same outcome, every single time. And then I'll show you why it's happening right now with NATO and the Arctic. The Delian League, Athens, 478 BC to 404 BC. Stage 1 happened fast because the threat was immediate and terrifying. The Persian Empire had just invaded Greece twice. In 490 BC at Marathon, in 480 BC at Thermopylae and Salamis, Athens led the coalition that pushed them back. But everyone knew the Persians would return. They had the largest empire on earth. They had unlimited resources. They had already demonstrated willingness to commit massive military forces to conquering Greece. So the Greek city-states created the Delian League, a mutual defense alliance with Athens as the hegemon. 200 city-states contributed ships or money. Athens provided the military infrastructure, the fleet, the best fleet in the Mediterranean, the commanders who had won at Salamis, the strategic coordination that had beaten the Persians twice. For 30 years, it worked perfectly. The Persians stayed contained. The Aegean was secure. Greek city-states prospered. Trust was high because Athens delivered results consistently. Then Athens overextended. Stage 2. In 454 BC, they moved the League treasury from Delos to Athens. For safekeeping, they said. Delos was vulnerable to Persian raids, they claimed. The treasury needed better protection. But then Athens started using League funds for Athenian projects. The Parthenon, the long walls connecting Athens to Piraeus, domestic infrastructure that benefited Athens specifically, not the alliance collectively. When Naxos tried to leave the League in 469 BC, Athens besieged them, destroyed their walls, confiscated their fleet, forced them back into the alliance. This wasn't a defensive alliance anymore. This was an empire, and every city-state in the League knew it. The junior partners started hedging: Corinth, Thebes, Megara. They began parallel negotiations with Sparta, quietly, carefully, not openly defecting, just exploring alternatives. Athens noticed but couldn't stop it, because addressing it directly would require admitting the League had transformed from a defensive alliance into an Athenian empire, and that admission would accelerate the defections. Stage 3, Sparta applied pressure, not by attacking Athens directly. That would be too risky, might unify the League against an external threat. Instead, Sparta applied pressure through proxies, through economic warfare, through systematic support of Athens' enemies. By 431 BC, Athens faced a choice: abandon the League's peripheral members and accept reduced influence, or commit to total war to maintain the empire. They chose war, the Peloponnesian War. 27 years of grinding conflict that consumed resources, manpower, and eventually Athenian democracy itself. And during that war, the junior partners abandoned Athens systematically. Not because Sparta was stronger militarily. Sparta's army was powerful, but their navy was weak. They abandoned Athens because Athens had demonstrated it would sacrifice League interests for Athenian survival. When Athens massacred the entire male population of Melos in 416 BC for trying to remain neutral, every other city-state understood the message. The alliance was dead. Only the coercive empire remained. Stage 4 arrived in 404 BC. Athens surrendered after their fleet was destroyed at Aegospotami. The Delian League dissolved overnight. Sparta didn't need to invade most of the former members. They simply switched allegiances. The power void filled itself. And Athens, once the dominant naval power in the Mediterranean, capable of projecting force across hundreds of miles of ocean, became a secondary regional player within a generation. By 338 BC, less than 70 years later, Athens couldn't even defend itself against Philip of Macedon. The city that had defeated the Persian Empire became a cultural museum. Militarily irrelevant. Check. Verified. Undeniable. The Habsburg alliance system. Spain, 1516 to 1648. Same pattern. Different empire. Different continent. Same outcome. Stage 1 was built on dynastic marriage and religious unity. Charles V inherited Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, parts of Italy, and massive territories in the Americas through a series of strategic marriages his grandparents had arranged. He faced the Ottoman Empire in the east, expanding aggressively through the Balkans toward Vienna. He faced Protestant rebellion in the north, threatening to fracture Christian Europe permanently. So he created an alliance system based on dynastic marriage and Catholic unity. It worked for decades. The Ottomans were stopped at Vienna in 1529. The Protestant princes were suppressed in Germany through military force and political maneuvering. Spanish silver from the Americas, flooding into Seville at unprecedented rates, funded the entire operation. By 1550, the Habsburg alliance looked invincible, but the costs escalated. Stage 2. Spain started prioritizing domestic Catholic orthodoxy over alliance flexibility. The Dutch revolt began in 1568, not because of military weakness, not because Spain couldn't project force, but because Philip II of Spain, Charles V's son, demanded religious conformity that violated the Netherlands' traditional autonomy. The Netherlands had always been religiously diverse. Protestantism had taken root there. Local governance had always been relatively independent. Philip II decided that was unacceptable. This wasn't about security anymore. This was about Spanish domestic politics, specifically the Catholic Counter-Reformation, exported as alliance policy. The junior partners noticed immediately. France started backing Protestant forces, not because France was Protestant. France was Catholic. The French king was called the most Christian king. But Spanish Habsburg dominance was now a greater threat to French interests than Protestant heresy. That's how badly Spain had miscalculated. By 1600, Spain was fighting in the Netherlands, in Germany and Italy, and in the Americas simultaneously. The costs were unsustainable. Silver imports peaked in the 1590s, and then collapsed as American mines were depleted and production costs increased. Spain defaulted on its debts 4 times, in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596. And every default weakened alliance credibility. When you default on debt, you're telling your creditors, who are often also your allies, that your financial commitments are unreliable. And if your financial commitments are unreliable, why should your military commitments be any different? Stage 3, the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, the ultimate stress test of the Habsburg alliance system. It started as a religious conflict in Bohemia. It escalated into the most destructive European war before the 20th century. And in 1635, France openly entered the war. On the Protestant side, Catholic France backing Protestant forces against Catholic Spain and Austria. Why? Because Spanish Habsburg dominance was now an existential threat to French security. The religious justification for the alliance had been exposed as a cover for Spanish imperial ambition. The alliance fragmented completely. Former Spanish dependencies negotiated separately, fought separately, surrendered separately. Spain couldn't coordinate a response because there was no alliance left to coordinate. The junior partners had all made their own deals. Stage 4, the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Spain recognized Dutch independence permanently. After 80 years of war trying to prevent it, they lost control of the Rhineland, lost influence in Germany, lost strategic depth in Europe. And within 50 years, France replaced Spain as the dominant continental power. The vacuum filled itself. By 1700, Spain was a secondary power, still rich from American silver, but strategically irrelevant in European politics. The pattern repeated. Exactly as before, the Soviet-Warsaw Pact, 1955 to 1991. Modern example. Same mechanics, same pattern, same outcome. Stage 1 was pure Cold War logic. NATO formed in 1949. The Soviet Union needed a counter-alliance. They created the Warsaw Pact in 1955 with 8 Eastern European nations: Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, and the Soviet Union itself. Mutual Defense Treaty, coordinated military command structure. Economic integration through Comecon, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. And for 2 decades it held, because the threat was real and immediate. The United States had nuclear weapons and had already demonstrated willingness to use them. NATO had forward-deployed forces in West Germany. The junior partners knew that without Soviet protection, they'd be vulnerable to Western pressure, potentially even invasion. But Moscow overextended. Stage 2 began in 1968. Czechoslovakia wanted domestic reforms. The Prague Spring. Alexander Dubček tried to create socialism with a human face, freedom of press, freedom of movement, economic liberalization. Not exit from the Warsaw Pact, not alignment with NATO, not abandonment of socialism, just internal liberalization. The Soviet Union invaded with tanks. On August 20th, 1968, 200,000 Warsaw Pact troops, 2,000 tanks. They arrested the Czechoslovak leadership, installed a pro-Soviet government, called it fraternal assistance. The Brezhnev Doctrine declared the Soviet Union had the right to intervene in any socialist country whose government was threatened. The junior partners got the message. Romania refused to participate in the invasion. Openly, Nicolae Ceausescu condemned it publicly. Poland complied reluctantly. Their government remembered their own 1956 protests. East Germany complied enthusiastically. They saw Czechoslovak reforms as a threat to their own rigid system. Hungary remembered their own 1956 uprising, brutally crushed by Soviet tanks, and stayed quiet. But the trust was shattered, because the Warsaw Pact was now clearly an instrument of Soviet domestic politics, not mutual defense. The alliance existed to protect Soviet control, not to defend members from external threats. The junior partners started hedging. Not openly, that would trigger intervention. Through quiet economic relationships with the West, Romania took IMF loans. Poland borrowed from Western banks. Through cultural exchanges, Hungary allowed limited Western tourism. Through delayed implementation of Soviet directives. When Moscow ordered economic integration, members complied slowly, incompletely. This was passive resistance, careful, deniable, but systematic. Stage 3 arrived in 1989. Gorbachev signaled the Soviet Union would not use force to maintain the pact. December 7th, 1988. He announced it at the UN General Assembly. Unilateral force reductions. No more Brezhnev doctrine. Nations had the right to choose their own path. The junior partners immediately tested this. Poland held partially free elections in June 1989. Solidarity won, overwhelmingly, 99 out of 100 Senate seats. The Soviets didn't intervene. Hungary opened its border with Austria in September 1989. East Germans started fleeing through Hungary to West Germany. The Soviets didn't intervene. East Germany's regime collapsed in November. The Berlin Wall fell on November 9th. Gorbachev did nothing. Why? Because Soviet domestic politics took precedence. Economic collapse. The oil price collapse of 1986 had devastated Soviet revenues. Ethnic tensions. Nationalism was rising in the Baltic states, in the Caucasus, in Central Asia. Political instability. Gorbachev was trying to reform the Soviet system itself through perestroika and glasnost. Moscow couldn't afford another Hungary 1956 or Czechoslovakia 1968. The costs were too high. The risks were too great. The junior partners saw this, and they made their move, not gradually, rapidly. Stage 4 happened faster than anyone predicted. The Warsaw Pact held a meeting in July 1991. They formally dissolved the military structure. 3 months later, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. December 26, 1991. The alliance died before the empire did. NATO didn't destroy the Warsaw Pact militarily. The Warsaw Pact destroyed itself through the same four-stage pattern we've seen before. Alliance formation driven by existential threat, overextension and mixed signals, strategic decoupling under pressure, inevitable collapse, 3 empires, 3 continents, 3 different centuries, ancient Greece, early modern Europe, modern Cold War, same pattern, same outcome. And right now we're watching it happen again with NATO and the Arctic, stage by stage. Let me walk you through it. Stage 1. NATO was formed in 1949, April 4th, 1949. 12 founding members. The threat was existential and immediate. The Soviet Union had just blockaded Berlin from June 1948 to May 1949. Communist parties were gaining ground in France and Italy. In the 1946 French elections, the Communist Party won 26% of the vote. Turkey and Greece were under direct Soviet pressure. The Greek Civil War was raging. Communist insurgents backed by Yugoslavia and Albania. Turkey faced Soviet demands for territorial concessions and control of the Bosphorus Strait. Western Europe needed American security guarantees, and America provided them, unconditionally, for 75 years. Article 5 of the NATO Treaty is absolute. An attack on one is an attack on all. That commitment created the longest period of European peace in modern history. No major European war since 1945, 79 years. That's unprecedented. Before NATO, Europe averaged one major war every 23 years. The 30 Years' War, the War of Spanish Succession, the 7 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, World War I, World War II. The pattern of recurring conflict was broken by American commitment. Article 5 deterred Soviet expansion. It stabilized global trade by securing European markets. It created the security architecture that enabled economic integration and prosperity. The European Union exists because NATO provided the security foundation. The junior partners surrendered military sovereignty. They reduced defense spending dramatically. In 1960, European NATO members spent an average of 4.2% of GDP on defense. By 2000, that had dropped to 1.8%. They relied on American nuclear umbrellas, American logistics, American intelligence, American command structures, American satellite surveillance, American aircraft carriers providing force projection. Because America demonstrated absolute reliability. Through Korea, defending South Korea from 1950 to 1953. Through the Berlin airlift, supplying West Berlin by air for 11 months. Through the Cuban Missile Crisis, facing down Soviet nuclear deployment 90 miles from American shores. Through the entire Cold War, maintaining hundreds of thousands of troops in Europe for 4 decades. The commitment was never questioned. American presidents changed, Republican to Democrat to Republican. The commitment remained constant, until now. Stage 2 started in 2017, Trump's first term. He publicly questioned NATO's value, called it obsolete in January 2017, before he even took office. He demanded European allies increase defense spending to 2% of GDP, not as a suggestion, as a threat. At the 2018 NATO summit in Brussels, he said, America might not honor Article 5 if allies didn't pay up. This wasn't private diplomatic pressure. This was public signaling. At a press conference, televised globally, The junior partners heard it. They started hedging immediately. France announced strategic autonomy. Macron said NATO was experiencing brain death in November 2019. He called for a European army, independent of American command. Germany accelerated Nord Stream 2 negotiations with Russia, a natural gas pipeline directly from Russia to Germany, bypassing Ukraine and Poland, against explicit American objections. The United States sanctioned companies involved in construction. Germany proceeded anyway. Poland increased bilateral defense agreements with the United States, separate from NATO structures. In 2020, Poland agreed to host additional American troops, paid for the construction of American bases, created a separate command structure outside NATO frameworks. These weren't alliance exits, these were contingency preparations, because when the dominant power questions commitment publicly, junior partners calculate alternatives. But it accelerated. In Trump's second term, the Greenland Ultimatum, January 7th, 2025. Trump declared Greenland essential to American security. He refused to rule out military force to acquire it. He publicly pressured Denmark to sell. Denmark is a NATO founding member, a treaty ally since 1949, one of the original 12. And the incoming American president threatened military action, publicly, against an ally for territorial acquisition, not defense, not response to aggression, acquisition. The Europeans didn't panic, they calculated. Within 48 hours, Denmark announced $47 billion in Arctic defense spending over the next decade, not through NATO, bilaterally, with specific focus on Greenland's sovereignty. They're buying new frigates, Arctic patrol vessels, air defense systems, all optimized for defending Greenland specifically. France and Germany issued joint statements supporting Danish territorial integrity, not through NATO channels. Through independent diplomatic statements from Paris and Berlin, Norway accelerated Arctic military modernization. They're building a new naval base in Tromsø specifically for Arctic operations. Sweden and Finland, NATO's newest members who joined in 2023 and 2024, began independent Arctic consultations. They're coordinating separately from NATO, building parallel command structures. The alliance is fracturing, not formally. Nobody's invoked Article 13, the withdrawal clause. Structurally, the trust is breaking, because the dominant power just demonstrated that national interests override alliance commitments. Denmark now knows that America might threaten military action against them for territory. Why would they trust Article 5 guarantees when the American president publicly considers them a potential target? Check. Verified. Undeniable. Stage 3 is happening right now. Putin is applying systematic pressure, not through NATO's eastern flank where everyone's watching. Through the Arctic, where NATO has no coordinated defense strategy, where individual members are exposed, where American reliability is now explicitly questioned. Look at the timing. This isn't coincidence. This is calculation. January 7th. Trump refuses to rule out force against Greenland. January 10th. 3 days later. Russia conducts its largest Arctic naval exercise since the Cold War. 43 ships. The entire Northern Fleet, including nuclear submarines, Akula-class attack submarines, Bore-class ballistic missile submarines carrying nuclear warheads, strategic bombers, 2 100XD Blackjacks, 2 95 Bears, conducting live fire exercises, hypersonic missile tests. They launched Zircon missiles, Mach 9 velocity, specifically designed to defeat American carrier defenses. January 15th, Russia announces new permanent military bases on Franz Josef Land, an Arctic archipelago 1,500 miles from Moscow. They're building all-weather runways, deploying S-400 air defense systems, stationing troops permanently. January 18th, China declares enhanced Arctic research cooperation with Russia, joint icebreaker operations, shared satellite surveillance, combined resource extraction projects. This is the beginning of a Chinese-Russian Arctic partnership, excluding the West entirely. This isn't coincidence. This is exploitation of a strategic opening. Putin doesn't need to invade Norway or Denmark. He just needs to create enough pressure that they question whether America will actually defend them. And Trump just gave him that opening. Publicly. Undeniably. Denmark now knows America might threaten military action against them for Greenland. Why would they trust Article 5 guarantees when the American president publicly considers them a territorial target? The answer is they won't. They can't. Norway shares an Arctic border with Russia, 198 kilometers, 123 miles, at Grense Jakobselv in Finnmark. They know Russia could apply the same pressure Putin applied to Ukraine, salami tactics, incrementally, testing responses. And they know Trump's position on Ukraine funding. He's questioned it repeatedly, called it a waste of American money. If America won't fund Ukraine's defense against Russian invasion, why would Norway trust American commitment to their Arctic border? Finland just joined NATO in April 2023, specifically because of Russian aggression after the Ukraine invasion. They have an 830-mile border with Russia, much of it in the Arctic, the longest border any EU country shares with Russia. And they're watching America threaten a founding NATO ally over territory. The calculations are happening right now in Copenhagen, in Oslo, in Helsinki, in Stockholm. Not about leaving NATO, about building parallel security arrangements. Because the alliance they joined no longer functions as advertised. Putin sees this. He's been preparing for this exact scenario since 2007. That's the year Russia planted a titanium Russian flag on the Arctic seabed, 2.5 miles deep at the North Pole. Symbolic, provocative, strategic. Since then, Russia has built 42 Arctic military installations. They've reopened Soviet-era bases that were abandoned in the 1990s. Nagoskoye, Tempin, Rogachevo. They've created a dedicated Arctic command, the Northern Fleet Joint Strategic Command. They've deployed S-400 air defense systems across the entire Northern Fleet area. They've stationed their most advanced submarines there, Yasen-class attack submarines, Bore-class ballistic missile submarines. They control the Northern Sea Route, the Arctic Passage along Russia's northern coast from the Kara Sea to the Bering Strait. 24,000 kilometers of coastline, and they're militarizing it systematically. While NATO has been focused on Ukraine, supporting their defense against Russian invasion, Russia has been securing the Arctic, systematically, deliberately, without opposition. And now, with Trump's Greenland ultimatum, NATO's northern members can't count on coordinated alliance defense. They're on their own. Stage 3, strategic decoupling under pressure. Check, verified, undeniable. Stage 4 is inevitable unless something dramatic changes. Let me tell you what happens next. NATO doesn't formally dissolve. That's not how modern alliances collapse. Nobody invokes Article 13. Nobody tears up the treaty. Brussels keeps meeting. The Secretary General keeps issuing statements. The organizational structure remains intact, but the strategic function dies. The alliance becomes a paper institution. Here's exactly how it plays out. Denmark increases bilateral defense cooperation with Germany and France. Outside NATO command structures, they create an independent Nordic-Baltic defense framework. Not replacing NATO, supplementing it. Because they can't rely on Article 5 anymore. Norway does the same. They're already talking with Sweden and Finland about Arctic defense coordination. They can't rely on Article 5 guarantees when the American president might side with territorial acquisition over alliance defense. The precedent is set. Finland and Sweden accelerate their own military integration. They're already culturally aligned. They share threat perceptions. Both border Russia. Both are in the Arctic. Both just watched America threaten a founding ally. They don't need NATO headquarters in Brussels to coordinate their defense. They can do it bilaterally, more efficiently. Poland maintains bilateral ties with America. They still want American troops on their soil. But they increase European defense commitments simultaneously. They've already seen America threaten an ally. They know they could be next. If American strategic priorities shift, they're building the largest army in Europe, 500,000 troops by 2035. That's not about NATO standards. That's about independent capability. The Baltics do rapid calculations. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. If America won't defend Denmark's territorial integrity against American threats, why would they defend Estonia against Russian pressure? They increase their own defense spending. They're already spending above 3% of GDP. They increase it further. They build regional partnerships. The Baltic states are coordinating defense procurement together. They're building integrated air defense, separate from NATO structures. They prepare for a future where American guarantees aren't absolute. France accelerates strategic autonomy. Macron's been pushing this since 2019. Now he has proof. NATO is unreliable because America is unreliable. France has nuclear weapons. France has force projection capability. A blue water navy, an aircraft carrier, foreign bases in Africa and the Pacific. France can build a European defense architecture. And Germany joins. Reluctantly, expensively, but necessarily. Germany is already increasing defense spending to 3% of GDP. 100 billion euro special fund for military modernization. They're rebuilding capabilities they let atrophy for 30 years because they can't rely on America anymore. This is the fracture. NATO continues as a bureaucratic organization. The building in Brussels stays open. Committees meet. Reports get written. But it stops functioning as a mutual defense alliance because mutual defense requires mutual trust, and that trust is gone. The moment America prioritized Greenland acquisition over Danish sovereignty, the social contract shattered. Every member now knows alliance commitments are conditional, based on American domestic politics, not strategic necessity. And Putin moves into the vacuum, not through invasion, through systematic territorial consolidation. Russia secures the Northern Sea route completely. They claim extended continental shelf rights under international law, Article 76 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. They submit claims to the Commission on the limits of the continental shelf for vast areas of the Arctic seabed. They establish facts on the ground in disputed Arctic territories. They build permanent bases, station troops, create civilian settlements, make the occupation irreversible. They build economic partnerships with China for Arctic resource extraction, joint ventures, technology sharing, infrastructure development, the Polar Silk Road Initiative, and NATO can't respond. Because coordinated response requires a functioning alliance. Denmark won't trust American leadership. Norway won't risk escalation without guaranteed backup. The new members won't commit to Article 5 enforcement if it's not reciprocal. The alliance fragments from within, and the power void in the Arctic fills itself. Russia doesn't conquer. Russia inherits. By default. Because the alternative collapsed. The pattern completes itself. Again. Now let me address what you're thinking. This time is different. America is too powerful. We have overwhelming military superiority. 11 aircraft carriers. Russia has 1. Nuclear weapons. Advanced stealth aircraft. The best navy. The best air force. Economic dominance. The dollar is the global reserve currency. Technological advantage. Silicon Valley. Artificial intelligence. Hypersonic missiles. This is American exceptionalism. We've always come through before. We won World War II. We won the Cold War. We'll win this one too. Let me tell you exactly why that's wrong. The Delian League had overwhelming naval superiority. Athens had 300 warships. The best trained rowers in the Mediterranean. The most advanced triremes. 40 years of combat experience. Nobody could match them at sea. They lost anyway. Why? Because military power is useless if your allies won't follow you into battle. Athens had the ships. They didn't have the trust. By 404 BC, when Sparta destroyed the Athenian fleet at Aegospotami, Athens couldn't replace it. Because their former allies refused to provide ships or money. The alliance was dead. The fleet was irreplaceable. Military superiority evaporated. Habsburg Spain controlled the largest empire in history. Spanish silver from Potosi and Zacatecas funded armies across 3 continents. At the peak, between 1540 and 1660, Spain imported 250 tons of gold and 15,000 tons of silver from the Americas. They had the best infantry in Europe. The Tercio formation, heavily armored pikemen in the center, arquebusiers on the flanks. It was unbeatable for 100 years, from 1534 to 1643. The Battle of Rocroi in 1643 ended that. But Spain lost the alliance long before they lost military superiority. By 1640, Portugal revolted, Catalonia revolted, Naples revolted. All simultaneously, the empire fragmented from within. Military power couldn't hold it together. The Soviet Union had the largest military on Earth in 1989. 5 million active personnel, 50,000 tanks, tactical nuclear weapons, strategic nuclear weapons. Nuclear parity with the United States they lost anyway. Why? Because their allies stopped believing the alliance served their interests. Poland in 1989 had a larger military than West Germany, but they used it to secure independence from the alliance, not to defend it. The Soviets had the force. They didn't have the legitimacy. And without legitimacy, without allies who believe in the mission, military force becomes a liability. It costs money to maintain. It can't project power effectively. It can't control territory without popular support. It collapses. Military power is not the same as strategic power. Strategic power requires alliances. Alliances require trust. Trust requires consistent behavior. And Trump just demonstrated America's behavior is inconsistent. That's not a political statement. That's an observable fact. A sitting American president publicly threatened military action against a NATO founding member for territorial acquisition. That happened. It's documented. That's not normal. That's not diplomacy. That's not strategic communication gone wrong. That's a fundamental reordering of American priorities. America just told its allies that territory matters more than treaties. And America's allies see it. They're responding rationally. Here's what nobody's talking about. Technology won't save this. Advanced weapon systems require alliance infrastructure. NATO's integrated air defense depends on data sharing across borders. 31 countries feeding information into a single system. That requires trust. Naval operations require coordinated port access. American aircraft carriers can't operate in European waters without European port facilities. Intelligence sharing requires institutional trust. 5 eyes. Intelligence sharing between America, Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand depends on everyone believing the others won't misuse the information. If Denmark won't share Arctic intelligence because they're worried about American territorial ambitions, the technology is irrelevant. The F-35 fighter jet doesn't matter if Denmark won't grant overflight permissions. If Norway restricts airspace access because they can't trust strategic coordination, superior aircraft don't matter. They can't fly missions without Norwegian cooperation. If Finland and Sweden build parallel command structures outside NATO frameworks, interoperability becomes impossible. The weapon systems might be compatible, but the command structures won't be. The American military is built on alliance integration. That's the actual source of American dominance, not just weapons. Coordination, forward basing, American troops stationed in 28 countries, logistics networks, prepositioning equipment, intelligence fusion, taking data from dozens of sources and creating a unified operational picture. All of it depends on allies trusting American strategic judgment. The moment that trust evaporates, American power projection collapses, not because the military got weaker, not because weapons stopped working, because the network got fragmented. And that's what's happening right now. This isn't about defense spending. This isn't about burden sharing. This isn't about Europeans not paying their fair share. This is about whether America's allies believe Article 5 is still reciprocal. Trump's Greenland ultimatum answered that question. No, Article 5 is conditional, based on American interests, not alliance commitments. Every NATO member heard that answer. They're adjusting their strategies accordingly. So what do you do with this information? 3 specific actions. Concrete, immediate, profitable if you act now. First, understand the Arctic is now contested territory. Everything related to Arctic shipping routes, Arctic resource extraction, Arctic infrastructure. It's all now subject to geopolitical competition without reliable alliance protection. If you're invested in companies with Arctic operations, understand the risk profile just changed. Massively. Norwegian Arctic drilling platforms, Canadian Northwest Passage shipping ventures, Greenlandic rare earth mining projects. All of them now operate in a security environment where NATO protection is questionable. That changes insurance costs, operating costs, long-term viability. Reevaluate these positions. Second, European defense stocks are about to spike hard. Denmark just announced $47 billion in defense spending over 10 years. That's an increase of 400%. Norway is increasing their defense budget. Finland is already at 2.5% of GDP. They're going higher. Germany is moving toward 3% GDP spending on defense. That's $220 billion annually. France is accelerating strategic autonomy programs, Rafale fighter jets, nuclear submarines, aircraft carrier modernization. Poland is building the largest army in Europe, 500,000 troops. That requires equipment, lots of equipment. Every single NATO member is about to increase defense spending, not because NATO said so, because they don't trust NATO anymore. They're building independent capability. The companies supplying that build-out are about to see massive contract awards. Rheinmetall, German defense contractor, already up 87% since February 2022. It's going higher. BAE Systems, British defense contractor. Saab, Swedish defense contractor making Gripen fighters. Kongsberg, Norwegian defense and aerospace. Thales, French defense electronics. These companies are about to see order books filled for the next decade. This is not speculation. This is observable policy shift happening in real time. Denmark's 47 billion, Germany's 100 billion euro special fund, Poland's defense expansion. These are committed budgets. The contracts are coming. Third, the dollar's reserve status is tied to alliance credibility. This is the part nobody's connecting. The petrodollar system works because America guarantees Middle East security. Through alliances, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, they price oil in dollars because America guarantees their security. The Asian security architecture works because America guarantees Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, through alliances. Those countries hold dollar reserves because they trust American commitment. The European economic integration works because America guarantees security through NATO. That security guarantee enabled the creation of the euro, enabled European trade integration, enabled reduced European defense spending that freed up capital for economic growth. If NATO's credibility collapses, every other American alliance becomes questionable. Japan is already talking about independent nuclear capability openly in the Japanese Diet. South Korea is accelerating their own deterrent programs. Taiwan knows they can't rely on American guarantees if America won't defend Denmark. The reserve currency status is built on trust, not military force, not economic size. Trust. The trust that American commitments are reliable, that dollars are backed by American power projection, that alliance guarantees are absolute. If that trust erodes, capital flows change systematically. Central banks diversify out of dollars, not all at once, gradually, but irreversibly. This is not a next decade problem. This is a next 24 months problem. The fracture is happening now. The capital flow adjustments are beginning. Watch treasury yields, watch dollar volatility, watch gold. The signals are already there. One more thing, subscribe. Because what I just showed you is one pattern. There are others. Debt spirals, currency collapse mechanisms, supply chain fragmentation, demographic time bombs, energy transition failures. All of them are playing out simultaneously right now. And most people won't see them until it's too late because they're not looking for patterns. They're reacting to headlines. Headlines won't save you. Pattern recognition will. So hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and understand this. The world you grew up in, the rules you learned, the assumptions you made about American power and alliance stability. They're over. Not next decade. Not in 5 years. Now. The Greenland Ultimatum wasn't a negotiation tactic. It wasn't Trump being provocative for leverage. It was the visible signal of a completed transformation. America just told its oldest allies they're negotiable assets, subject to revision based on domestic political calculations. NATO just became a voluntary association, conditional, revocable. And the Arctic just became the theater where the 21st century's power structure gets decided. Putin knows this. Xi Jinping knows this. Every European foreign ministry knows this. Every defense planning staff in every NATO capital is rewriting contingency plans right now. The only people who don't know are the ones not paying attention. Don't be them. Subscribe. Watch the next video. Understand the pattern. Because what comes next is predictable. It's systematic. And it's absolutely inevitable.